The Today is really about the evolving mathematical concepts in financial planning and financial planning models and tools and technology and things like that. And specifically, it's about how incorporating additional variables really allows us to more realistically represent the uncertainties of the future. And so, by the way, we're going to do three quick polls throughout. These are up or down, yes or no kind of polls. So really easy, but that'll add a little bit of fun and context. So if you'll keep your eyes open, if I don't mess it up, I will try to launch those polls at the appropriate time. Let's see here. Okay, so let's start kind of the chronology really in the 70s, and I will get some of the obvious questions out of the way. Yes, I was around in the 70s. No, I was not in financial planning. I was in grade school. So from the 70s really until kind of the 90s, financial planning was really based on static modeling. So this would be a constant assumption for investment returns, constant assumption for inflation, and then you would examine cash flows and in and out and produce some semblance of financial longevity based on that. So this graph is overly simplistic, but you get the idea. If you have a constant, in this case, 7% per annum return, you do get a little bit of, nonlinear growth here because of the compounding, but it's pretty straightforward. So I'll call it the 21st century, the last 25 years or so, financial planning models have really been dominated by Monte Carlo simulations. I'm sure this group is all too familiar with them. They typically use a single volatility to stream potential portfolio return paths based on risk level until some single point in time. Usually it's like Jane or John Doe's 90th birthday or something like that. By the way, kudos to anybody that recognized this lovely photo, which is the luxury casino from Monte Carlo. You can actually see all the fancy cars. I was there many years ago. It does really look like this.
Hey, Mark.
By the way, yeah, go ahead.
I think your screen sharing is paused because we're still looking at the title screen.
Oh, all right. So let's see here. I don't know why that is, but let me go back. Let's see if we can figure that out. Let's try that. Oh, is that changing for everybody?
Yep, it's changing now.
Yes? Okay. All right. So that was my very simple illustration of a static compounded rate of return over time. Not that important. This was my photo illustration of from Monte Carlo, in Europe, the casino and all the fancy cars. Again, not really that important. By the way, while Monte Carlo simulations have really dominated financial planning type processes, after static models, there was really a second kind of offshoot of more advanced planning. I don't think it really caught on. Certainly not as much as Monte Carlo simulations, but there are some planning tools that run specific historical scenarios. I think what is good about that is that it's based on actual history. What has been a limiting factor and why I think those did not catch on the way Monte Carlo simulation modeling caught on was because you were limited in the number of historical scenarios you could run. And if you had, let's say, if you had 80 years of data and you were running various 30-year paths, you had 50 of them, but the data in the middle, in a sense, counted in more of the paths than the data at the end. The first year and the last year of your 80-year history was only in one of those historical scenarios, whereas the data in the middle would have been in a lot of them. And so you couldn't really get a sense of probability, of likelihood. And financial planning is a lot about likelihood. So I think for that reason, I think what dominated that next big shift in modeling was really Monte Carlo simulation modeling, and that became popular really in the late 90s and really predominantly in the 2000s and still exists today. Is that still changing? Where you see my illustration of all my squiggly lines, Adam?
You're good.
Okay. So this, I'm sure everybody's seen things like this. We surveyed a lot of advisors a number of years ago about their experience with clients. And, the feedback was really that simulation modeling or illustrations like this, it conveys the notion that, ooh, this is complicated, but didn't really teach somebody something per se. And I'll tell you something that's really interesting about this illustration. As overwhelming and congested as it is, it's actually only 100 paths. We at one point tried to graph 1,000 paths, and it's just kind of muck at that point. So the illustrations, so many tools over the years had put illustrations like this in the hands of advisors to put in front of clients, but it doesn't really teach the client a whole lot other than say, "Ooh, this is complicated." By the way, there are better ways, I think, to illustrate that than showing all the squiggly lines. So I'm going to put our first poll question up if I can figure out how to do it. Let's see here. Polls. So the question is, do you think that volatility of the stock market will generally be fairly consistent over several decades? And we actually look at it over 20 years. And just to be clear, we're not talking about the stock market being stable. We're talking about volatility. So the standard deviation, the variance of the stock market, will that be relatively stable over long enough periods like 20 years or so? Okay. All right. I am going to give everybody a few seconds to lock in their answer, and then we'll end that. So it looks like with a small majority, it looks like a little more of you said yes than no, about 60-40 said yes than no. Let's see. All right. So I am going to actually show you an illustration that we did. There we go. So this is rolling 20-year volatility. So obviously volatility changes all the time, and certainly the stock market and other risk assets change all the time. But this is 20-year rolling volatility of the broader stock market. I think we used a broad combination of large and small cap and foreign and domestic and things like that. So even if you ignore the very kind of upper left hand side of this graph, which you can see this starts in the 40s. So this includes the roaring 20s and the depression, which is part of why these volatility is so high. But even if we kind of ignore that, even just within the last few decades, I mean, we see volatility down here in the 12% range per year and volatility up in the, call it 19% range per year over a 20-year period. I mean, that's proportionally a 50% difference in the dispersions over a 20-year period. So think of a typical person retiring in their 60s and living until their 80s. So that's kind of like a 20-year, roughly representing a retirement horizon for many. But that's a huge difference. So it's something to keep in mind as you think about modeling and how you want to represent kind of potential outcomes for clients. Okay. So poll question two. Poll question two. Make me share question one. That's our 60-40. Okay. I don't know why it's sorry, I'm not responsible for my own technical difficulties here. Let me try one more time. Seems like it's stuck on the first poll question. Oh, all right. I think I got it. Nothing like live TV, folks. All right, here's question number two. Do you think the correlation between stocks and bonds is generally fairly constant? Again, we're talking about over a 20-year time frame. We're not talking about from year to year, which obviously it's changing. Okay, so we see several of you have voted. Audience pretty split evenly. Let's take a look. Okay. So these are rolling 20-year correlation. And just for those of you who are really into math like me, we are using coefficient R, Pearson's R, as opposed to R squared. And the reason we like to do that for something like this is that R squared doesn't show you a positive or negative relationship. It's just showing you the significance of the relationship. So by using R, we're able to look at periods of time that had negative correlation. We saw some not that long ago, but this is 20-year. This is 20-year data. Now, we used broad stock market and broad bond market. You will see different results when you use, say, long-term treasuries versus short-term treasuries or versus credit or other aspects. This would be a very, very broad kind of think total bond market type illustration, but still very significantly different. You know, when we look at periods down here where substantial negative correlation, remember, you're talking about 20 years, right, versus substantial positive correlation. So when you're thinking about risk levels typically expressed as an asset allocation, we'll think stocks to bonds, although I know they can be a little more complex than that. The relationship between them can differ really rather dramatically, even over a 20-year period. So when Monte Carlo simulation models are using a current composition and they are using today's covariance matrices, just understand that can vary dramatically, even over a multi-decade type time horizon. Okay. Oh, I got one more for you. So third poll question, do you think that inflation is generally fairly constant over a long period of time? I will tell you again, we used a 20-year period for our illustration, so I'm going to let you vote on that. And I promise this is the last poll. So don't worry, we're not going to spend our whole time polling. Okay, I think we're getting a little poll fatigue. We're not getting as many participants, but it looks like more of you felt that no, inflation over a 20-year period will not be that constant, and we'll take a look at those results. So here's your average inflation, again, over a 20-year period rolling. And so we can see that inflation, we look at the very early part of this graph, which remembers in the 40s. So it's accounting for the deflation, the substantial deflation during the 30s. And that's why that is such a low number, even over a 20-year period. So that's pretty anomalous. Not that it cannot happen again, but there's certainly a lot of structural things in place to prevent that from happening again. I personally do not think that is at all likely to happen again, but we still will see it varying. So even if we look past that period, we see certainly lots of periods in the 2 to 3%, which is where the current regime typically targets. But we obviously, well, some of us remember inflation, even which hit significant double-digit inflation for shorter periods. But this is showing us that even for 20 years, we saw inflation over 6%. For 20-year periods, for a number of 20-year periods. So I think that's kind of interesting when we think about using single path inflationary scenarios or single number inflationary scenarios inside of financial planning processes. That can be a limiting factor. So we just want to keep that in mind. Okay. One of the other things I want to talk about, we're not going to do a poll, so don't worry about that, is lifespan. It is common to look at a predetermined lifespan. Jane or John Doe gets hit by a bus on someone's 90th birthday or something like this. We actually have good data about variance in lifespan, mortality probability distributions. And what you'll see on the screen here is we put two individuals. We did not differentiate by anything other than generic age. So we took these from the publicly available data set. And so we used two different ages just so you could see the slight difference. So you'll see in this example, somebody is 54 and somebody's 55. And so you'll see slight differences in the blue and the orange curve. But when we put them together, when we contemplate a second to die probability of these two individuals, it is a significantly different distribution. Now, most planning exercises are not using variable lifespan. So what most advisors do to accommodate that is they pick a time frame that is conservative. So even if the client's life expectancy is in the 80s, they'll pick 90 or they'll pick 92 or they'll pick 95 or something like that. And so that's their way of accounting for both the fact that there might be two people here where there have to be resources to last both of their lifetimes, as well as the fact that it's an uncertainty, right? We don't know how long Jane or John Doe are going to be around, thus use their resources. So that is the typical approach. But if you have the availability to incorporate variable lifespan, an uncertain time frame, that is an added step up in terms of sort of the efficacy, if you will, of your exercise. So the last illustration was literally just age-based generic, but there's also good data around differing mortality distributions. And besides age and gender, women live longer than men statistically. Besides that, we have the three H's, as I like to think about them. We have health, habits, and heredity. So health being chronic illness, body mass, cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar, things that you'd probably be discussing with your doctor. Doesn't mean that the client has to discuss that with you. That may not be appropriate or might not necessarily be a comfortable conversation, but you can always ask your client just in general, how's your health? Is your health better than average? Not so much. They may be comfortable giving you some general feedback. Habits would be your lifestyle habits. Do you get a good night's sleep? Are you a smoker? Do you get regular exercise? Do you have good nutrition? Things like that. And then family history, heredity. So this is really about your blood relatives. Some of us are just luckier than others, and that is a factor. I will tell you that years ago, when we first introduced variable lifespan into our own models at Tolerus, a smart advisor said, well, that's really cool, but my clients aren't average. And for those Keeler fans, it made me think of Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average kind of thing. So like most advisors, his clientele, they have above average means, they have above average education, they have above average access to healthcare, all of which contribute to greater life expectancy. So he really was correct. His average client was above average. And that actually makes a lot of sense when I thought it through. So how about risk level over time? Do you think that most clients keep today's risk level forever? We're not going to do a poll, but I think we know the answer is on average, most do not. And now for some people, it may be appropriate to keep the same risk level. And there are actually situations where risk levels should increase over time or in periods of time. But by and large, if we're looking at broad populations, we would say no. And generally speaking, they tend to go down as somebody approaches retirement, reaches retirement, deeper in retirement, things like that, where they are approaching or in a period where they're utilizing resources faster as a percentage of their assets. We clipped this from Russell a number of years ago just to illustrate a glide path and the fact that when they looked at different mutual fund monikers that had, target date funds and things that had built-in glide paths, they were different. They were rather different. And, if you don't have other resources, using a generic glide path like somewhere in this range is pretty reasonable. But can you imagine customizing the glide path for each of your clients based on their actual inflows and outflows, their actual financial chronology, their actual limitations on their willingness to accept risk? It can look very, very different for each client. And so having the tools to do that, to incorporate that into your financial planning is really a great way to customize and deliver something that's really bespoke to each of your clients. So what does the next gen of financial planning models and tools and mathematics, what does that do to better represent the possibilities and the probabilities of reality? I'm mainly going to speak to how we went about it, but obviously there are different ways to achieve these things, but I'll at least give you some things to think about. So here's 4 main areas that I would suggest focusing on. One is that concept of an evolving risk directive, meaning not presuming today's risk level is necessarily the most likely one in the future. Now, my suggestion is you want to make sure you have an objective way to do this. I don't think you want to just subjectively say, we just presume that it's just going to get lower in the future. That's sort of weaker to defend and explain and so forth. But again, it may be better than nothing in some cases. Dynamic inflation. We looked at the charts before, and even over a 20-year type period, we know that inflation can be very different. So limiting ourselves to a static kind of inflation or even a single path for inflation can be a limiting factor. Correlations, we talked about that as well. So accounting for the fact that the relationship between risk assets like equities, bonds or interest rates, inflation, that those relationships do change, and to be able to incorporate the fact that they aren't necessarily constant is a nice evolution in the way of financial planning tools. And then the last one, which we talked about, we showed on the screen, the variability in lifespan, being able to incorporate the fact that we don't know, the group of financial planners and investment advisors, we don't know how long Jane and John Doe are going to be around and drawing on their resources. So rather than pick a single number, or rather than even just pick something conservative, think about being able to incorporate the variability. That is a nice way to make the process more efficacious. Now, all that said, you don't want to put something that looks too complicated in front of your clients. That, for most clientele, it loses a lot of the helpfulness if it's hard to understand. So you want them to understand that you've incorporated the uncertainties, the things you don't know, because they don't know either. They don't know how long they're going to live. They don't know what the stock market or bond market are going to do in the future. They don't know what inflation is going to be. So these are all very understandable concepts, but you want to make sure that you're presenting to them in a way that is digestible, that's understandable, that's impactful, that they can, with your guidance, they can make better decisions. And I think that's the key. You want something that's robust, but is simple to explain to nearly all clients, so that it can really be utilized. That seems to be the demand for advisors in sort of the next gen process. Just a couple illustrations just to try to punctuate some of what we're talking about. Now, we use a standardized scoring scale. You don't have to. There are lots of good tools out there that use their own proprietary scoring scales. Nothing wrong with that academically. For us, a Toleris score of 40 equates to a stocks to bonds benchmark of 40/60. So, sorry, my mouse a little all over the place. So that's what that 40 means here. We do it just to make the communication easier. But again, there's nothing wrong with having your own 1 to 7, 1 to 10, 1 to 100, however you like to do it. 14% probability of running out of money. We've made this a really simple display. It is very, very robust because it accounts for the fact that risk isn't necessarily constant. Lifespan's not a constant. Inflation's not a constant. But boiling it down to something very simple makes it much easier for the client to understand. And that's usually the way you want to go. We do provide other deeper analytical support tools if an advisor is working with a client that does want and benefit from going in deeper. But I find most advisors stick with the simpler illustrations because that's what resonates with most clients. Now, a lot of people are visual. Not everybody's visual. So you want to have tools in your tool chest that give numbers to the clients that are going to benefit from numbers. Obviously, visuals work for a lot of people. You may have clients that need a narrative. Explain to me what's going on, and so it's important to have tools that help you do that too. By the way, the illustration on the bottom is a popular one because it shows, this is maybe a more unique situation, but it shows a glide path where risk is very low in the beginning. In this illustration, I think somebody had a huge distribution, like they were buying a property or something very soon. And after that, their financial ability to take risk went way up because it was going to be a long time till they were utilizing their resources, at least for a while. And we see this is not uncommon to see someone's financial ability to take risk decrease at some point, but it's not always the case. And I've seen situations where financial ability goes up later in life, which, we could always talk about that if there are questions. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Oh, this is a really neat illustration that I find advisors say pretty universally very, very popular with clients, working clients, because it shows them what percentage of all their future expenses are already funded today, and how with each successive year they work, they are funding more and more of their retirement. And we actually even see periods where they are overfunded. If they worked late enough, they'd be overfunded. And what would that tell them? It would tell them they could actually increase their lifestyle by the given percentage indicated and still be fully funded. If they want to retire earlier, we could see, I can't hover and get the exact number, but we could see, let's say a couple years earlier, they could be fully funded if they lived on 90% of their lifestyle. So this, and by the way, in the system, this is just a picture, but in the system, you can see the exact numbers and all that kind of stuff. This is a really powerful way of getting to the answer of such a common question of when can we retire and what's the trade-off if we go earlier or we go later. Really important that whatever you do, whatever scale you use, whatever tools you use to help measure the client's willingness and ability to take risk, you want to make sure you're measuring portfolios too. You want to make sure you're putting things on the same scale, making it easy for somebody to compare. Obviously, the portfolio we put in here doesn't really compare with the Toller score 40 from the other screen, but that's okay. You want to be able to show somebody that you've been as diligent in measuring the risk of a portfolio as you were in measuring the right risk level for them. Their willingness, their ability to take risk, and whatever is constraining for them. So that's really important. So I put on social media that we might even get to what some would consider the fourth generation. What's coming next? What haven't we thought of and haven't we experienced, or what are we just starting to experience? And you can't really have that conversation without talking about AI. Now, AI for most people now is LLMs, it's large language models, things like ChatGPT, although now there are a lot of competitors to that too. They're really good at a lot of things. Right now, we're not seeing it advance in the way of the mathematics. What we're seeing is that, well, we certainly can't contemplate all the advances in this area. We're seeing that the advances seem to be much more about process, communication, and interaction. And that's going to make the business of providing advice, the service, it's going to make it easier to scale. It's going to make advisors more efficient. It's going to allow advisors to reach the right people at the right time. Inundating clients every day with follow-up is not helpful to them. So it's about figuring out the right cadence and who needs what services from you right now. Most clients are not going to need your services every single day. So AI is really helping leverage the advisor's time. I do not see AI replacing advisors. I know there's some people who want to get scared about that. I don't really see that, certainly not anytime soon. But I think advisors who are embracing AI and using tools that are leveraging AI to improve the process, improve the communication, improve the interaction, they are going to be the winners in this. They're going to be they're going to grow faster and they're going to be more profitable. And that I firmly believe. Oh, a couple things. So this is just an illustration of our compliance center. I think AI is going to have an impact in compliance. It's going to enable advisors to handle regulatory compliance in a bigger scale. I don't think this necessarily is just for bigger firms, although maybe the example is more obvious when you have a lot of advisors. How do compliance officers really stay on top of a lot of advisors with a lot of clients, a lot of different risk levels, a lot of different portfolios? How do you make sure everything is at the right level and has been done in a timely way? But even if it's a small firm, I think it's just as important. It may be that at a solo shop, that individual advisor is doing this for themselves. But guess what? They're still going to get examined by a regulator, whether it's maybe it's not the SEC at a smaller firm, maybe it's the state regulator. But they're asking the same kinds of questions, and they want to see a process that demonstrates that culture of compliance, that demonstrates you have a handle on this. And so, leveraging technology with AI to be able to do these things in scale is really, really helpful. This was the AI companion I briefly mentioned before. We use it again. It's not really used in the mathematics, but it's used to allow an interactive dialogue, kind of like a chat GPT type experience where the client can type or they can talk to it, but it's connected to their financial data, whether it's the native data in Tellurisk or you brought it in from eMoney or Money Guide or wherever. It's allowing the advisors to provide a 24/7 dynamic conversation that's not only capturing the information back to compliance, but it's also highlighting the actionable steps. Did this client indicate they're panicking over something going on overseas, right? Are they going to pull all their money out and put it under the mattress, right? Should you drop everything and contact them? Or maybe they're retiring, or maybe they're getting a divorce, or maybe they are moving, or some other life event that warrants an update to their financial plans and their risk assessment. It's going to alert the advisor to things like that. So leveraging AI for these kinds of purposes really allows you to be more bespoke in the service you provide and do it with less time, essentially more efficiency. So couple questions that I get a lot about us. So I'll just take a quick minute. We're really geared towards the fiduciary process. You can use it as a solo advisor. You can use our own interface and links and all that kind of stuff and build it into your website. If you're involved in a robo-advice solution, it can sit behind that. It can sit behind record-keeping technology. It can sit behind, corporate type planning tools if you work with a larger organization. Everything's available via APIs, so you don't have to use our front-end tech. If you want the mathematics, if you want the infrastructure, we make it available to provide inside of other kinds of tools and tech. I am happy to take other questions. We're actually a little ahead of schedule. So Adam, if you have questions or the audience has questions, happy to address anything really.
Yeah, if you have any questions, you can feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm not seeing any right now at the moment, but that was not what I expected, Mark. That was really good. That was great, really good information, and especially for financial advisors who don't like seeing some of these things that are typically really, 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 call it dumbed down. I thought that was really interesting, and I love the polls, by the way. So if you did more polls, that would be fine with me.
All right, good, very good.
First question we have here is: Did you study using real returns instead of nominal?
Great. That's a great question. So we actually did a hybrid of the Monte Carlo simulation and the historical scenarios. We came up with a way of fixing the major limitation of historical scenarios so that it could be probabilistic like a Monte Carlo simulation. So we run a simulation. We don't call it technically a Monte Carlo. So if we want to get really specific, to be called a Monte Carlo simulation, you have to use random numbers. We don't use random numbers. We don't do it for two reasons. One, we want to root everything in history. We do have some combinations of historical events that didn't occur in the order in which they are presented. So we are a little bit more conservative than the actual historical scenarios, but we did it in a way that could be treated probabilistically, so we could run probabilities on all of these scenarios. We do allow the advisors to calibrate. So in other words, one advisor might say, my capital markets assumptions in my planning tools or my practice are that over the next generation, equity compound returns will be 9%. And somebody else might feel like they want to make it 8%. We allow them to adjust the compound average. We don't allow them to adjust the actual paths because they are rooted in history. And so in other words, we're not letting them monkey with the changing correlations and the changing volatilities and things like that. The other real advantage of our process is that we can get those dynamic inflation, dynamic correlations and volatilities, and we can still run it super fast. You can, when I worked at Citi, my tech budget was astronomical, and we ran some really, really big multi-factor Monte Carlo simulations, but they run overnight. They're not something that would be satisfying for an advisor-client dialogue who says, "Hey, well, what about if we run it this way?" So that's also one of the reasons that we built our process the way we did. There is a downside to it. There's always a trade-off. So the downside to what we do versus a traditional Monte Carlo simulation is that we cannot use your exact portfolio. We can use a portfolio of the same risk level, but we can't use your exact portfolio because it's very unlikely that you have enough historical data to run the 100 years of monthly data. We have 1,200 paths. We have 100 years of monthly data. Nobody has portfolios that have been around that long. So it's just not practical. And so for us, mathematically, I felt that the trade-off was well worth it to give that up, to be able to have dynamic correlations and dynamic volatility and dynamic lifespans and things like that. So that's a great question. I hope that I answered it. But if there's a follow-up, let me know. I love talking about this stuff.
In case there's a follow-up, I've got a question for you, Mark. Just
Sure.
specifically to risk tolerance questionnaires. There's a handful of choices out there, and I'm just curious what you say to the the people that say that if somebody fills out a risk tolerance questionnaire, let's just say, and it happens to be in at a time like now, where the market's maybe kind of flat. People are seeing things in the news, maybe freaking out a little bit, but nothing's crazy. How that's different from being in a, just raging bull market where the news is all good versus, being in the middle of, let's just say, the tariff crash last April or February.
Yeah, it's another really good question. What I would first tell you is that there are different types of personality profiling questionnaires, and there are pros and cons to different ones. I'll give you three of the most popular types. I'm not citing specific companies or vendors, but three of the most popular types, though this is not all of them. There are some that measure preferences, sometimes called revealed preferences. This is where you're typically giving somebody various choices and they're telling you which combinations of risk and reward and things like that they prefer. So it's revealing their preferences. I think the benefit of a profile like that is it gets to what somebody wants right now. The downside is, just as you were alluding, what they want right now might not be what they want 6 months from now, maybe not a month from now if there's a lot that feels different. And so it tends to be extremely susceptible to changes due to often exogenous factors. Did your portfolio drop, right? Did your neighbor's house go into foreclosure? Did your sister lose her job? Are there stressful signs, whether directly or with one degree of separation, that you've been exposed to, these exogenous factors that make you prefer less risk and reward? That is very real and can be a challenge for advisors, because if, let's say, you profiled somebody when the environment's been pretty benign, no fault of your own, but then something happens, stock market drops, that's when somebody says, oh, I think we have too much risk. They don't say that when everything's going great. We know this. They say it when things are not going well. And the problem is, as my mom used to say, that's like closing the barn door after the horses have escaped, right? You don't want to reduce risk after there's been some big drawdown that makes everybody so fearful. So that's one type of personality profile. Another type incorporates expectations. The problem with that is really that human beings, as studied by psychologists, are notoriously poor at accurately expecting risks. I think that's been well documented. But there are certainly questionnaires that do ask questions about somebody's expectation for the future. Now, that's different than asking about their expectation for the portfolio in a stated scenario. That is different. But if the questions are asking about whether somebody thinks is going to happen to the stock market or the bond market or interest rates or inflation or gold or whatever, those questions rely on somebody's, we'll call it acumen, who, even when you study advisors, to be perfectly honest, by and large, we're not a group of people that are overly good at predicting those things. I'm sure there are some that are much better at it than me, but by and large, that's not been a really reliable driver. Another popular type of personality questionnaire is called a psychometric study. We do use this, just in full disclosure. We were not the first ones to use it. We're not the last ones to use it. It's been around for many decades. It's a type of psychological profile that is using a normative scale. So in other words, it's identifying an element of personality. So usually it's an underlying trait It asks a series of questions to an individual and compares them against the answers to the same exact questions for a large population. So what you're gathering is really where within the bell curve. I don't know if Adam can you guys see me if I'm making finger gestures there?
Yep.
So you can objectively determine, let's say we gave Adam this profile, we could see that he's in the 63rd percentile. Now, by the way, it's not that one outcome is better than another. It's simply saying if we are measuring how risk-seeking to risk-averse an individual is, where do they fall on that bell curve relative to a population of statistical significance? As I mentioned, we didn't invent it. It's been around a long time. We did our own study, so our questions might be a little different. And we, had our own little twist on it, but we certainly didn't invent it. There are psychometric studies that measure other elements of personality, how optimistic or pessimistic someone is, how introverted or extroverted somebody is. These are all traits that tend to stay with us. That's the benefit. To get back to your earliest question, Adam, was, what about if you profile somebody in a better economy or a worse economy? These are traits that tend to stay with us. If you were an optimist as a 25-year-old, you are more likely an optimist as a 50-year-old. Same thing if you were an introvert versus an extrovert. Same thing if you are generally more of a risk seeker versus if you are more risk averse. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't go through something that is life-changing. It does not mean that. People do. But it is the most stable type of personality profile that I'm aware of in this context. So that's the reason we chose that academic framework. We also don't limit the outcome to just that score. In our model, the personality profile, that psychometric study, that just serves as a cap. So ours is rooted in the mathematics of financial longevity. It's looking at the inflows and outflows of the client's finances, savings and spending patterns, and other income streams, and the big capital expenditures or big inflows or things like that. Those are all going to influence their financial ability to take risk as well as their financial longevity. It's the same kinds of inputs, which is why we integrate with tools like eMoney and MoneyGuide, because you're using the same data. So if any of you are using eMoney, MoneyGuide makes for a nice process to have your risk profiling exercise tied in with your financial planning exercise. That's different than tools that might integrate in a way that just sends a score over or something more basic. We want to actually transmit the financial data so that these processes are really linked together. They're really deeply integrated together. I think that, my opinion is, that makes for a much better fiduciary process. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it does, definitely. Yeah, because it's I'll never forget the first time somebody challenged me with that. God, it's been 15 years ago or so, and it was really interesting. It's one of those things, you go through a process, you get used to that process, and you don't think of intentionally breaking it if it's working, or at least if it seems like it's working. So, no, I appreciate that.
I'll tell you, I'll add one other thing, which I've heard from a number of advisors. If your risk profiling process is only personality, which for a lot it is, when the client questions their risk directive, that's the only tool you can update with regard to their risk tolerance. If you're measuring someone's financial ability, if you're doing it in a scientific way, an objective way, most advisors are not even going to bother re-administering a personality profile. If they think the client's panicking, why would you want to ask them questions that potentially, even though a psychometric study is more stable, you still potentially could get that panic type of response? So just update the objective things, same way you would in your financial plan. You would update the objective things. Are you still saving this amount? Are you still spending this much? Are you still going to retire when you told me you were going to retire? Still putting your kids through school, right? If the objective data has changed, you're going to update your financial plans, and that might necessitate a different decision. Same thing with your risk assessment. If objective data has changed, by all means, update the risk level. But don't put a personality profile in front of a client who you think is panicking. Even with a psychometric study that might tend to be more stable, I still wouldn't do it.
No, it makes total sense to me. Well, I don't see any other questions. So, if you think of anything else, please, by all means, email us. If you'd like to get a hold of Mark, probably the easiest way is to find him on LinkedIn. If you'd like to check out Tolerus, just go to tolerus.com. It's really, really cool software. You can even get, Lee mentioned, you can get a demo. I know that wasn't the purpose at the beginning of this presentation, but still, I want to highlight it anyway. But otherwise, thanks everybody for joining. Again, the CE credit will be automatically submitted. And, there's lots of opportunities for presentations like this, and you chose to give ours a watch or a listen. So thank you again for your time, and we'll see you next time.